All right, guys, in this video, the goal is to go a little bit deeper into the cardiac cycle and add a few more elements and kind of expand on some additional things that we need to cover to make sense of it all. So as a quick recap from last time, remember on this graph, we're superimposing a handful of different things. You've got an electrical signal from an ECG up top. You've got heart sounds that are showing you when valves are closing. And we've got three different pressures, right? Same as the slightly simpler graph that I showed before, where we have pressure in the atrium. That's the purple line in this graph. We've got pressure in the left ventricle, which is the blue line, and pressure in the aorta. The thing that we're adding to this now is we've got ventricular volume on here, which shows you when blood is entering and exiting the ventricle. And we've also got valve opening and closing down here as well to sort of put everything in context for us. So the easiest way to get through this is to treat it as three different time points or a time series. The first is the blue area here where the P wave is. That is going to correspond to atrial systole, right? That's when the atria are contracting. Everything in tan on here after the QRS is going to correspond with ventricular systole, right? When the ventricles are relaxing. And that also happens to be atrial diastole when the atria are relaxing, but we don't really see that anywhere on here because it's kind of masked by everything going on in the ventricle, right? And then from there until the next P wave, this is ventricular diastole. And technically everywhere in blue is ventricular diastole, but I separate the part where the P wave is because of what the atria are doing. Okay, so let's take it one stage at a time. You start off with your P wave. Remember, the P wave was generated by the SA node, right? Your rhythm generator or pacemaker. And that P wave is directly leading to atrial systole. All right, so the P wave is really just the signal that we see on the ECG that occurs when the SA node hits threshold and we get a wave of action potential spreading to the atria. They contract. All right, if the atria contract, it makes sense that their pressure goes up a little bit, right? Contraction generates pressure. And notice, I know this is getting kind of picky, but it's important. Right here during this phase, the purple line, the atrial pressure line, is higher than the blue line, right? And remember, blood only moves from high to low pressure. And so if pressure is high in the atrium, lower in the ventricle, this explains why the ventricle is filling, right? This graph down here is ventricular volume, just volume in milliliters. And if it's going up, that means the ventricle is filling. And if it's going down, it means the ventricle is emptying. So at this point, we're contracting our atria, we're pushing blood into the ventricle, and at that point, our ventricle hits its maximum volume. We call that number EDV for end diastolic volume. It's the volume at the end of diastole, right, the end of relaxation, because during all the blue area on this graph, the ventricle is relaxing and filling. Okay? So let's make a note of that. Our EDV in this example was approximately 120 milliliters. That means this left ventricle had 120 mils of blood in it, right? And once that's accomplished, the atria are going to relax, right? We have this little pause in the ECG. That's where the AV node is pausing the action potential. And once the AV node releases that signal, that's when we get a QRS. The QRS is very specifically what is leading to the ventricles contracting. And you can see that by the spike in this blue line. So ventricular pressure goes up because the ventricle is contracting. And when these two lines cross, remember that's the mitral valve closing. It would be the tricuspid if we were on the right side. But this graph just happened to be made for the left side. And the idea is as soon as pressure in the ventricle goes above the atrium, remember the valve is just like a door. If you blow some air on one side of a door, you can make it slam shut. The blood in this case is just pushing towards the atrium. That's the direction the valve closes. And that is why our AV valves go from open to closed right at that point. Okay, remember AV valves, those are the same thing as saying the mitral if we're on the left side or the tricuspid if we're on the right side. Okay, so we've closed our AV valve, the mitral, so that we don't get backflow into the atrium. Pressure keeps going up and up and up. We eventually cross paths with the aortic pressure line, right? So when the ventricle's pressure is higher than the aorta, that allows the aortic valve, or the pulmonary if we were on the right side, to go from closed to open. So they're trading places. Right, back here where we're blue, AV valves are open because we want blood to flow into the ventricle from the atrium. Once we're in the ventricular contraction and systole, now we want those to close so we don't get backflow, and open the aortic and pulmonaries, right, to let blood flow out of the ventricles and into the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. Right, so no coincidence. That exact moment when the aortic valve opens is also the exact moment when the volume of the ventricle starts to go down, because we're pushing blood out of the ventricle into the aorta, and that keeps happening as long as the ventricle is contracting, and eventually you get to the bottom. The ventricle does not ever go to zero. That would mean the walls are touching. We can't do that. So ESV is end systolic volume. That's how much blood is left in the ventricle at the end of the contraction, and it's always going to be like at a minimum 30, 40 mils, maybe more, because again, we just can't go to zero. All right, so this can give us some important information. If EDV was 120 and ESV was 50, that means that we started with 120 mils in the ventricle. We ended with 50, which means that 70 must have been pushed out. That's your stroke volume. Stroke volume is just the volume of blood that gets pushed out of the ventricle in one contraction. And remember, that stroke number or volume number matters because if you multiply that by heart rate, that gives us our cardiac output. Okay? So the heart rate you can't really see on here. You would have to have a time scale and measure how frequently the beats are coming. But just remember, if you want your cardiac output to go up, we want to increase that stroke volume. And increasing stroke volume could involve two different things. It could mean that your EDV gets higher, right? We fill the ventricle full of more blood so that you have more to push out. Or it could mean that ESV gets lower, right? If there's less blood in the ventricle at the end of the contraction, that means you must push more out. And so either one does the trick. Fill fuller with more EDV, or squeeze harder and push more out, lower ESV. Either way, higher stroke volume. All right. Okay, so we've got the blood pushed out of our ventricle. Now we're going to have a T wave, which remember is T wave is a signal that the ventricles are repolarizing. And that repolarization is causing relaxation. Pressure in the ventricle is going to go down. And as soon as we go below the pressure in the aorta, we're going to get the aortic valve or the pulmonary on the right side to go from open to now closed, because the ventricle is about to start refilling. And we definitely don't want the ventricle refilling by having blood backflow from the aorta right back into the ventricle. So aortic valve has to close, right? Pressure keeps coming down lower and lower. As soon as it comes back below the atrium again, below the purple line, now our AV valves, mitral or tricuspid, they can open, right? Because these valves opening are what allow us to refill, right? Move blood from the atrium into the ventricle again, right? That explains why ventricular volume is going up. And notice it's a bit odd. The P wave hasn't come yet, so the atrium isn't actually contracting right here. But we said that the ventricle is refilling passively because pressure from the pulmonary veins on the left side or the vena cava on the right side are pushing blood into the atrium. There is some pressure there, and the pressure in the ventricle is so incredibly low, like single digits, close to zero, that even without the atria contracting, you can still get some blood pushed in. And then eventually you will have another P wave, and the atria will contract, give you that final push, and fill the ventricle as full as it needs to be. But that's just bringing us back to the exact same point that we were over here. Okay. So when you're studying this, my advice is go through and explain it like you're teaching it to someone else, right? Step by step, start with the ECG, which chamber is contracting, why is the pressure going up, where's the blood moving to and from, which valves are closing, which valves are opening. If you can make sense of this graph, that's a very, very big chunk of what you need to know to understand heart physiology.